Hopefully that's weight off of your mind. What it leaves in the queue, though, is one last assignment and the final exam. So we've already talked about the parameters of the final exam, and I'll reemphasize all of that the week after Thanksgiving just to give you a few more details. But long story short, it's a cumulative final, and the material kind of naturally builds. And so I think it would be worthwhile to review past in-class exercises, particularly for the more complicated things that you may have forgotten since the time that it was taught. So, it's been a while since maybe you did incremental analysis or external rate of return or economic service life. So any of those things could show up on the final exam. So today and then Monday of the week after Thanksgiving, we're going to talk about uncertainty, risk, and sensitivity analysis. And then on Wednesday and Friday of our last week of classes, we're going to talk about taxes. So we're going to talk about the things that are very uncertain and the things that are virtually guaranteed. They say that the only things that are certain in life are death and taxes. So we'll do the flip side of that today in talking about uncertainty. Any questions before we start talking about today's new material? Okay. Economic uncertainty is the notion that it's difficult to predict unknowns about the future because there are so many moving pieces and so many conditions that are subject to random variation or to decisions of a variety of government policymakers and executives that it's hard to know, for example, how interest rates will change over time or how materials prices may vary or the cost of labor and the availability of people available to do a certain job or even the demand for the products that are being produced. So there are a lot of driving factors that play into economic uncertainty. So it could be political conditions. And one of the big political conditions that's going to be changing in West Virginia is, I think a lot of people have already heard, Joe Manchin has announced he's not going to run for Senate again. And so West Virginia has had a lot of special attention and special federal funding over the years to try and sway Joe Manchin one way or the other on various things. And so when you don't have someone who's sitting on the fence on a variety of issues, it could mean that less money comes to West Virginia. So that's just an illustration of how one senator of medium importance in the grand scheme of things across the world has a really outsized local economic impact. And so a related thing, changes in government policy. For the last 3 years, we've had the Biden administration that's been spending money on its priorities, funds that were made available, for example, through the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so it was a law that was passed by Congress, but there is a little bit of flexibility given to whatever executive branch is enacting the law to spend money on which priorities are most important to them. They're administering, for example, which grants are solicited first. And so it's been grants related to changing environmental conditions or grants related to broadband availability. And a different federal administration, a different executive branch could change policy and could reprioritize which elements of that bipartisan infrastructure law should be funded first. Natural disasters, it's not anything in human control, and right now you may be following the news that there's a volcanic eruption in Iceland. And there was a different volcanic eruption about 13 years ago that had a huge impact on air travel between the United States and Europe because there was just a huge plume of a cloud of ash and debris that was through high enough range of altitudes that air traffic was all but shut down for several days and radically curtailed for weeks. And it stranded people on vacations. It delayed parts and air freight. So Sometimes it's just natural disasters, and it's unexpected. Um, and then it's behavior of groups that's sometimes hard to predict, like the irrational exuberance or bubbles, economic bubbles that can form related to new technologies. And so we went through an internet bubble. Some people probably would say that we're going through an AI bubble right now. We've previously been through lots of real estate and housing market bubbles. And so eventually those bubbles can pop. And the tricky thing is that you don't know when. Even if you know that there's a bubble, it can be very painful for an investor who is selling short a certain company or a certain industry. Short selling is where you borrow shares of a stock and you sell it, and your notion is that you're going to buy back the shares of the stock in the future when the price is lower and then give it to whoever you borrowed the stock from. And so in that way you can profit when the stock market goes down. If you sold the shares that you borrowed at a high price and then you give them back to the person you had borrowed them from after purchasing at a low price. And so sometimes people think that a company is going to go down or an industry is overvalued, and so they'll short sell that industry. But in the meantime, you don't know when the market is going to peak and when the prices are going to go down, and they're having to pay interest, and their investors can be impatient. And so it can be really a wild ride for people who are trying to count on a bubble popping at a certain time. So there's lots of uncertainty. And the reason why we care about this in this course is that we're trying to understand the economic factors that tie into engineering. So whether to expand, whether a new product line should be invested in for some hoped for future revenue. So since we don't know what are the prices that you could earn or what are going to be the costs associated with a new product line, it can be really dangerous and risky in a climate of lots of variability and economic uncertainty. So risk is tied to uncertainty. Uncertainty is just not knowing what's going to happen, and then risk is the probability of consequences that are negative that arise from that uncertainty. So the potential for adverse changes that could negatively impact businesses, industries, and whole economies, which is collections of industries. There's two categories of risks. Some are known. And by that, what we mean is not necessarily whether or not it's going to happen, but these are risks that arise often enough that we have a clear characterization of the distribution of frequencies. So there are enough people who've lived and pretty predictable lifespan, pretty predictable rates of accident and injury and disease that insurance companies and other actuarials can provide a statistical analysis of the probability of death in a given year. So you can see this figure just represents both for male and females the probability of death in any given year by age. And so in 1 year, you have an almost zero probability of death while you're young, but then it begins creeping up so that, for example, by the time you're 100, if you make it that far, most people won't have made it that far, but by the time you make it to 100, in any given year, there's a 25% risk that you die in that year. So there are certain things that can be characterized with a lot of confidence. And so flooding is another thing that, because we have about 100 years of flood data and rainfall data in a lot of places, we have a statistical characterization of how deep the depth of precipitation will be for a certain return period. So what's the storm depth that's associated with a 1 in 100 chance in a given year? Around here in Huntington, it's about 6.5 inches. So 6.5 inches of precipitation in a 24-hour period is about the 100-year storm. Other places have other depths depending on their local climate conditions, but those are examples of known risks. And you can hedge against known risks by purchasing an insurance policy. So you can prepare for them, you can take it into account, and it won't necessarily ruin you if you've correctly priced in the known risks that could arise. But unknown risks, we may know what the thing is that could happen, and sometimes it's a risk that not only do we not know the probability distribution, but it's just something that we haven't thought of yet. So alien invasion, we have no idea what's the probability in a given year that there will be an alien invasion. We don't know if it's possible. We don't know if it's going to happen because it's never happened before that we know of. The risk of a computer virus, shutting down a factory's production floor. That's not something that happens with enough frequency, and it's not subject to natural factors either. In the case of lifespan or precipitation, those have underlying scientific principles that govern the probability distribution, where human behavior is less regular. And so, someone uploading a computer virus, it's not a natural law that governs how often that's going to happen. So we can't hedge against unknown risks in the same way that we can hedge against known risks. Insurance companies are reluctant to write a policy to insure against unknown risks because they don't have an understanding of what's a reasonable price. The contract that they issued could say how much you get if it happens, but Berkshire Hathaway couldn't write an insurance policy insuring Marshall University against an alien invasion just because maybe that's an extreme case. Maybe they'd be all too glad to write that policy because they view it as so unlikely. But the point is that you can't insure yourself against the risks that you don't know how probable it is. It's more difficult to hedge against that kind of risk. So let's just talk about 3 different types of variation. These are good illustrations of how things can change in a short-term environment, and it would have a huge impact on a company that was trying to make plans for expansion, whether to hire new workers, whether to increase your capital base, meaning the equipment, the real estate, your ability to produce.
Your interest rates are the same number.
Oh, well, yeah, that's not right. I was pasting it. This one, I think it was 7.97. So you can see over here on the vertical axis, it's approaching 8% recently. This is the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. And so within just over 2 years, it went from below 3% to well above 7%. And we're going to look today at the effect that interest rates can have on profitability. But the effect that it has on a home loan, like if you have a home and you're financing $200,000, and the interest rate is 0.0265, or the interest rate is 0.0797. If we find out what is the mortgage for that, so I've got a calculator that does financial calculations. Let me just go into the solver. And we'll do a finance calculation for a 30-year. This is the 30-year, so that would mean that N is 30 years times 12, so that's 360 payments. So for 360 payments and an interest rate per year of 0.0265, and the present value is 200,000, then the monthly payment would be $557.77. So that's a pretty easy payment to make. A lot of people would consider buying a home rather than paying rent if your house payment is only $557 per month. Now, the reality is you'd also have insurance and taxes added on, but it would still be under $700, even including the insurance policy and the taxes. But if you've got an interest rate of 7.97, then that would take that same mortgage monthly payment from 557, let me just update the interest rate to 0.0797. I think I must have typed something in here. Oh, yeah, it shouldn't be as a decimal. So, oh, it's been a while since I used this calculator. I usually do it manually. So 2.65%. All right, this is going to take the payment higher. So 805. 805.93 versus 0.0797. 1463.35. Okay. So what that means is that if you have a fixed mortgage rate, like if it's a fixed rate, then that means that the interest rates can vary, but you're not going to be subject to those alterations. And so if you locked in your mortgage in January 2021 at this really low 2.65%, then it doesn't matter if things go high or low, you're going to have the same payment. There are some loans that are variable interest where the interest rate and therefore the payment that you've got is going to be going up and down with the fluctuating values that are available in the market. Those are dangerous because there's just so much uncertainty about what your payment would be. And if you had a variable rate loan and you were accustomed to paying $806 per month and then suddenly it's nearly $1,500 per month, that would make a lot of people default on their mortgage. They simply wouldn't be able to keep up with the payments. Or if it's somebody who's originating a new fixed loan in October of 2023, it may be that they simply can't afford as much house as they would have been able to. So, now they're looking for a 2-bedroom home instead of a 3-bedroom home, or maybe they're just putting off the decision to purchase a home altogether. So interest rates can vary, and it's not very easy to predict where things are going. Most people seem to think that it's as high as it's going to get for now. I mean, the sentiment is that it's probably going to be going down, but nobody is exactly sure how low it'll get. So it's hard to know when to purchase a house. Do you wait a little longer so that the interest rates can fall? When do you lock it in? It's a lot for people to consider. Commodity prices can vary maybe even more dramatically and more quickly than mortgage interest rates can. This is a figure that I got from the, I think it's the International Energy Administration, and they keep track both of fuel costs but also a lot of commodity prices. And so you can see that in a 1-year period, this was back in 2017, aluminum prices increased by more than 30% during that annual period. And I had no idea why metal prices went so high in that year. And so I did a little bit of a search. And what I found, Forbes magazine suggested that it was because of economic stimulus in China. So in China, they tried to stimulate the economy by increasing the amount of construction that was happening, increasing and subsidizing vehicle production, just basically boosting demand for things and try and get more economic activity in China. And since we have a world economy, if there's more demand for metal and materials in China, then that raises the prices everywhere. It's not going to keep the prices low here simply because a steel producer in the United States can sell their products anywhere in the world, and there still may be tariffs in some countries where they're selling their products, but most markets are international these days, and so price increase or decreases in one place can have a huge effect all over. And so the same thing is true for crop production. I looked in the case of sugar. I was curious to know, why did sugar prices fall so much in 2017? And the reason why is that in 2016, the prices went up a lot. And so that sent a signal to farmers that they should grow more sugar. And then they definitely did. And so then prices went back down again. This was a decrease in prices that came after a year of really high prices. And so I guess we could think of it as a good thing that prices were abnormally high in 2016, and then that price pressure was relieved. But for the farmers who were planning on the high prices, and they planted crops, and they were, purchasing fertilizer and hiring people to bring in the crops, and they were counting on those higher prices, then it's going to be really painful and disruptive for them if the prices are 25% lower than what they'd originally considered. So commodities can vary a lot. This is a figure that shows the unemployment rate over the last several decades. And I think we've talked about before how, anytime there's a recession and companies begin shutting down, there's more bankruptcies and layoffs, that the unemployment rate is higher for a while, and it gradually works its way down. But then these shaded areas are associated with economic contractions. And so, anytime there is falling demand for goods, then firms start to have layoffs, and that increases the availability of labor. So from the perspective of the people who are working, these are bad times where the peak is high. A high peak is for the everyman. The person who is unemployed, it's a bad time. But from the perspective of a company, the bad time is these low spots. A company has a hard time finding the people that they need when the unemployment is very low. That not only means the wages have to be higher for them to attract qualified applicants, but it just means that there isn't as much turnover, and they simply may not be able to fill the position whatsoever, regardless of the price that they're willing to offer. So lots of uncertainty, and what we're going to look at today with our in-class exercise is what is the effect of that uncertainty? And we're going to do it by looking at an automotive production example where we are planning to have a new factory produced. And let me pull this up on the screen and also give you the handout. Okay, so we've got an auto manufacturer that is subject to a lot of uncertainty. They don't know what their steel prices are going to be. They don't know what their labor costs are going to be. Computer chips have been in the news a lot lately, where a lot of vehicles were being almost finished, and then they just have to park them in storage because they didn't have the computer chips to finish it the rest of the way. So the cost of the chips went high, the availability went down. So this kind of takes all of it into account. There's ranges of expected values. Need one more? Got it? Any extras over here? Okay, so let's just review a couple of key concepts on this one before you get started, because there's a lot going on here. So in the end, we want to calculate profit. What's the range of profit that can be experienced? And so you remember the basic formula for how to calculate profit? Good. So profit is revenue minus costs. Okay, so in this example, we're going to have to find out what's the revenue per year and what is the costs per year, because that's what it wants to know, is the range of annual profits that could be expected. Okay, so the revenue, that is going to be the price, the purchase price multiplied by demand. That's how much money comes in. Price times demand tells you revenue. the costs, there are several different categories of costs. So let me just write out the costs that we have. First of all, there's capital cost. So that's the annual cost of the equipment. So, you know, this factory, it says in the handout, the factory is going to cost $1.2 billion to prepare the new assembly facility. So that's a one-time cost at the present. We want to find out what's the annual equivalent of that $1.2 billion. So there's the capital cost. There's going to be labor cost. And I'm going to say capital cost per year, labor cost per year. That's ultimately what we want everything expressed as. There's going to be the steel cost per year. There's the computer chips per year. There is other inputs as they're described. And so I think those are all of our cost categories. There's the capital cost, which we're going to annualize the initial purchase price, and that seems to be the only thing that we have some certainty on. Everything else is expressed in terms of ranges. For example, the interest rate varies from 4.75 to 6.75. So the initial purchase price is known, but the annual equivalent of that, there's going to be a range because of the range of interest rates. So what we want to find out is the best case, and the worst case. Okay, so the demand is itself also varying. The problem statement says that the demand is going to vary from between 20,000 and 30,000 vehicles per year, and the price has some uncertainty. The price, the anticipated sales price is between $32,000 and $41,000 per year. So we want to know, we're going to do one analysis that's the best case analysis and one that's the worst case analysis. My recommendation is to set this up on Excel. It will just be dramatically simpler and quicker, especially because we're going to be substituting values in and out depending on if it's the best case versus the worst case. So think about what gives you the highest costs and the least profits, and set that up as your worst case scenario. So what things would make your costs high would be, like, for example, high interest rates. What would make your costs high? Well, a big vehicle weight and a high steel cost is going to give you the worst case scenario where you have high costs. So best case is high profit, or let's say high revenue and low costs. And then the worst case is low revenue, high costs. Okay, so I'm going to pause from talking, give you some time to think and set this up in Excel. I don't have a template for you intentionally because I want you to just set this up on your own and think about translating the given data into a set of revenue and a set of costs. And remember to annualize a lump sum present value, the 1.2 billion. You should use the PMT function in Excel to find out what's the annual equivalent of that one.
got a question. So, for the best case, are you assuming high demand or low demand? Because high demand.
In the best case, what I've done is I've maximized everything for the revenue. So that means the highest sales price and the highest number of demand. And then I've minimized everything that has to do with costs. So the lowest interest rate, the lowest amount of labor hours, the lowest amount of steel price, lowest amount of steel use, and all that. So what we end up with, I think, is that the best case analysis is $813 million per year of profit. And then on the low side, if we have high costs and low revenue, then the profit would be $192 million per year. And by the way, the costs should all be tied into the demand, so the number of units per year. And let me just make sure that I may have anchored my references. Let's see here, the labor cost. No, okay. Yeah, it looks like it was relative. I didn't do the anchoring over to B5 for my demand. Now, we're not completely sure whether this is the maximum profit, because we've talked before how maximizing revenue doesn't necessarily maximize the profit because of the cost per unit, the variable cost per unit issue. And probably it is in this case with this example, and the way that we could check is we could do a sensitivity analysis, or we could use the solver. If the solver is enabled, I don't see it here, but let me turn that on. Solver is kind of like GoalSeek, but with some enhanced abilities. So let me turn on the solver. So what we want to find out is what is the number of, what's the demand that would maximize the profit? And let's do solver here. And so we want the profit to be maximized by changing the demand. And we have to add in the constraint, though, that the demand can only be, it should be less than 30,000 units. So less than or equal to 30,000 units. So this will just allow us to check and see if maybe there's an even better amount of profit below 30,000 units. Okay, so we're saying set the profit to maximum by changing the demand. And the demand, it can be anything below 30,000. So solve. And so 30,000 is the most profitable. So 813 million at the high, 192 million at the low. So what's different about what we're going to do on Monday is we're going to have it do a random distribution of a lot of different parameters to find out what is the distribution in profits. We know the bounds, but we don't know what's the most likely outcome. We only know the extremes by doing an approach like this. The best case, the worst case, but what's the most likely case? And that's what we're going to do on Monday after Thanksgiving with something called Monte Carlo simulation. Do you have a question?
Where did you count for indirect costs? The $1,500 per unit.
Did I forget the indirect costs? Are they in there?
Yeah, they're right under new vehicles anticipated labor hours. 0.6788.
Oh, right. No, I haven't accounted for indirect costs. Let me do that. Yeah, so what we could do is just add it to the other inputs.
Yeah, so my profit will bring up to more like 700. So I got, yeah, 760.
You're not gonna play over Christmas?
So you got 700 and 68 million with the indirect accounted for?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks for catching that. Yeah, I omitted the indirect costs. Other inputs and indirect.
I'm way off, but it's not obvious to me how I'm off. If I sent you the spreadsheet, could you look at it?
Let's just look at it now.
Okay. I took a bit of a different approach where, anyways, I'll see you.